It's going to be my first video. It's going to be my first video to a series of different videos. This video, I'm going to start off with titling it, Why I'm No Longer a Jehovah's Witness. So, the only way to do this is just to go back to the beginning, at least as far as I can remember. I will only be telling this story from my perspective, from things that I personally experienced. I definitely want to be respectful to my family, to my parents, but I am a advocate for healing out loud. As a crisis specialist, I've worked with several Jehovah's Witnesses and ex-Jehovah's Witnesses on the crisis line. Many of them were suicidal. I worked with families that actually had their family members or their kids basically unalive themselves and just holding everything inside. And so with the work that I do, it's just important for me. So my story is, I was born and raised a Jehovah's Witness. My story goes back to my parents when I was born. This is obviously before, I can't remember, but it was no secret in my family. It was no secret in my community. I was born initially out of wedlock, right? And so when you're a Jehovah's Witness and you're born out of wedlock, 9 times out of 10, your parents are going to get disfellowshipped. So when I was actually born, my parents were disfellowshipped. Even though they were disfellowshipped, they still were, like what I like to say, they were physically out, mentally in. So what did that mean? Physically, they were out the first 4 years of my life, not really going to the Kingdom Hall, but they never gave me Christmas or any of our birthdays or holidays. My grandmother still had to sneak me, Christmas presents and Easter baskets and things like that. Speaking of my grandmother, her story, to tap into this, is that my grandmother was Baptist. My grandparents initially they went to church, right? They went to church. They were born and raised in church. And it's my understanding that when my mom was about 9 years old, my grandfather started studying with the Jehovah's Witnesses, eventually became a baptized Jehovah's Witness. My grandparents did not let it affect their marriage. My grandmother still got her Christmas tree. She even studied with the Jehovah's Witnesses, but she never got baptized. She never made that commitment. She just always told me that there was only one God. And she studied with various different types of religions, but she stuck with her King James version of her Bible, which she read all the time. And whenever we talked about God, which was quite frequently, she just would always tell me there was one God. And even from the early age, child, being afraid of, Armageddon, and I'm going to die in Armageddon, and my grandma's going to die in Armageddon. She would always tell me there's only one God, and no one knows, when that day is going to come, but just always encourage me to remain positive. It's my understanding that it's the same kind of a situation with my dad, on my dad's side of the family. So basically, I'm a third generation Jehovah's Witness. What that means is my grandfather on my mother's side was Jehovah's Witness. My grandmother on my father's side was Jehovah's Witness. And it's my understanding that both of my parents were introduced to it when they were about 9 or 10 years old through their parents. They in turn got baptized, and then when I was born out of wedlock, my parents were disfellowshipped. Now I'm going to move forward into what I remember. I remember being 4 years old. I remember going to the Kingdom Hall. And what I remember was we would always go late. And in hindsight, now I know why we always went late. My parents, of course, didn't explain it to me back then, but we would always go late after the song had already started, before the prayer happened, and then we would always leave early during the song. And the reason for this is because my parents were disfellowshipped, so no one was allowed to speak to them. They were trying to get, back into the hall, and so in order for them to do that, they had to make it to all their meetings. So there was the Tuesday meeting, and then there's a Thursday Bible study, which was in someone's home, usually. And then, of course, there was a Sunday meeting. Now, when you're disfellowship, of course, you're not going out in field service. You're just pretty much, and you're not going to Bible study if it's in someone else's home. You could only do that if it was in the Kingdom Hall. So I don't remember exactly how long it took. My parents, it's really odd. I have a very good memory, and I can remember from being a very young child, but I don't remember exactly how long it took. I do, however, remember them getting reinstated. I remember they gave them a party. I remember a cake. I definitely remember pictures of the cake, and I remember where it was because it was in my grandparents' back house at the time. Moving forward, I remember my mom getting pregnant with my brother, and at that point, we were back in. So that meant all the things. That meant doing all the things, the field service, all of that. I do remember at a young age really loving Jehovah and having a deep connection to God, especially when I would be with my grandmother. But I knew from a young age the consequences of being disfellowshipped because it was in my family. And so I got to see it firsthand. My mother's brother was no longer active. And my dad's brother was no longer active. So I missed out on a lot of good times with them, because I remember as a child, my dad, not wanting me to spend as much time with them because he would say, well, they're disfellowship. I did learn as years went by, it wasn't that they were disfellowship, it's that they walked away. They walked away. It's not my story to tell. But they had their reasons where they decided that they no longer wanted to be Jehovah's Witnesses. I do remember my grandma. I was very close to my grandmother. My grandmother was more like, she was the closest. She was the closest in my family. I didn't go to preschool, so I basically was with my grandmother from the time I was born while my parents worked up until it was time for me to actually go to kindergarten. And my grandmother was very active, even as a parent helper, going with me to all my field trips in kindergarten. So I was very close to my grandmother. And when I look back, I just think about how my grandmother, she did her best to be honest with me. I had a relationship with my grandmother where she didn't lie to me and I didn't lie to her. And so as time went by, I just remember her explaining to me that the elders had came over and told my grandfather and her that my uncle was not allowed at the house. And I remember my grandma saying that, there's only one God, but just due to some of the practices of the witnesses, she would not be a Jehovah's Witness. She wasn't going to interfere with my grandfather, but she was not going to not talk to her child because her child was no longer a witness, or not allow my uncle to be welcome in her home anymore. Now that I think about it, I just can still see the look on her face when she used to tell me that story, because I can only imagine now. I'm 47 years old, someone telling me that I can't talk to my kid, because my kid is now an adult. And even if they did something, or they decided to stop going altogether to the Kingdom Hall, I just couldn't imagine. So, my situation with being a Jehovah's Witness and growing up, it was very hard. There were a lot of aspects up into my teenage years that I loved about it. But then there was this side that I knew that if I ever changed my mind, then I wouldn't be able to have my family. And I knew what it felt like to not have a relationship the way I should have had with my uncles. And so, yeah. Another side of it was, at a very young age, I had another uncle who's no longer with me, who was basically married to a woman whose family was Jehovah's Witness. And I saw firsthand, when I would be at their house, the different things that would happen. I saw how her mother, discouraged her from supporting him going to church. And it was very hard for me at that time, because my uncle had got on drugs. And the one thing that I will say that is common as Jehovah's Witnesses, and someone might argue me and say, well, you grew up in Compton, so, drugs was just there. But I will say I had firsthand experience of my uncles, and then I also had firsthand experience of people that I even grew up with in the Kingdom Hall that later on got disfellowshipped, got baptized at a young age, got disfellowshipped, and their parents stopped talking to them, and they unfortunately they landed hard on drugs, and it forever changed their life. And in hindsight, when I look back at it, I think of, a lot of people use substances to cope. I work in that field, and I'm a drug overdose trainer, and so I'm very familiar, and have a lot of experience when it comes to that. Jehovah's Witnesses have a high level, a high chance of getting into substance abuse, because you're shunned. Disfellowship means you're basically shunned. And I know they recently changed that word, from disfellowship to remove, but that's for another video. I will say, and I will be very respectful to my parents on this one, I was raised in a household that, we had domestic violence. My father was abusive. My father was a screamer and a hollerer and a yeller. And I forgive him for that. I do know that he grew up in a family where his father was very abusive to his mother. And so, he just repeated the cycle. And a part of my reason for this video and doing what I do is because I just refuse to pass that generational trauma down onto my kids. And so I have to do this. So I grew up in a household where my father, was a screamer and a hollerer, a yeller. And in hindsight, it's so crazy, because I think back to different things that he would do. And I've had several conversations with other Jehovah's Witnesses, and just videos I've watched, and there's a high, there's a high connection with that religion, basically having a lot of domestic violence going on, um, whether it's physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, religious, however, they don't do anything about it. So it's very discouraging. I would go to the Kingdom Hall, and from a very early age, teenage years, end up after the meeting in the back room discussing several things that were going on in my home. And at the time, I really loved Jehovah. I believed in it. I was raised in it. So, I would go to the brothers and I would share with them some of the things that I was doing at home and some of the things that we were dealing with at home with my father. And, they would talk to him, but nothing would really be done. He still would be able to get on the stage and have his little Bible readings or comment at the meeting or pass the mic, and I learned at a very young age, which was a pivotal time for me because here I am, a young teenage girl, right? And I'm going to these brothers, and I believed in them. I really thought that they would work with my dad to help him work on his personality, because his personality at the Kingdom Hall was completely different when we got home. And so, being a young teenage girl and confiding in these men and trusting these men and growing up with these men, I just really believed that, I don't know, some type of mentorship. They would take my dad under their wing and kind of help him through those things. Because of that, I will say I don't want to make my video all negative. There were some positive things that came out of being born and raised a Jehovah's Witness. I did develop a lot of relationships with different people. And I was very grateful for that because my home life was toxic and it wasn't a safe space for me. Definitely, wasn't good for my nervous system. I was the oldest, and so here I am trying to, protect my little brother and sister. I'm dealing with a lot. So I connected with a few families at the Kingdom Hall, and this was my opportunity to get away, right? This is an opportunity for me to spend a lot of weekends, spend a lot of nights going to some of the friends' homes where it was safe for me. I didn't have to deal with the parents arguing and fighting and screaming and hollering, and yelling. And so it was safe for me. So I will say those were the positive moments. In the Jehovah's Witness religion, there's this sense of, we're all friends and you can trust everybody. And so I will say that growing up, even though I would go and spend the night at different friends' houses and everything, I always felt safe at their homes, which that was a positive to it. We grew up and we lived in two separate homes. So my experience basically was through a few different congregations. And once again, some of those were good memories, and then some of those were not so great memories. I think that, I'm not here to try to convince anybody to not be a Jehovah's Witness. That's not my purpose. I do believe that when you first wake up and you have to deal with this and unpack everything, there is a sense that you want to go to your family and you want to explain yourself and you want to tell them, why you're leaving, and you're doing all of that in hopes that they'll still continue to talk to you, right? And the reason my story is so unique is because I was doing everything as a baptized Jehovah Witness. I just didn't get baptized, right? So, I remember becoming an unbaptized publisher. I remember going out when I was young, knocking on doors and going out in field service and doing all the things. So, I was not baptized once again, but I was being treated as if I was baptized. The expectation was still there. I will say that if you are a Jehovah's Witness, or if you're the parent, and you're taking your kids, protect your child's mental. There's a lot of things that go on in the home where you're going to the brothers and you're trying to get support for the things that are going on in your home, and they only do so much. Especially if the man is friends with the elders, if they're friends or they have a relationship, it's always, well, what the wife isn't doing, or what the kids are doing. I remember getting to the point where I became a teenager, and I was seeing firsthand the mental toll that the marriage was taking on my mom. And I got to a point where I would stand up to my dad. I'm like, look, at that moment, that's when the problem started with him. And I say that because in the culture of Jehovah's Witnesses, the women already don't have a voice. So my mom didn't have a voice. And so here I come along trying to be the voice for her. And, all that's going to do is make it even worse between me and my dad. But I've always had a very strong personality. So, if it meant that we weren't getting along, if it meant, he got to the point where he literally just stopped doing for me, stopped buying me school clothes at a young age. So put me in a position where I was like, okay, the culture of Jehovah's Witnesses, I feel like it teaches you, if you don't do this, then I'm not going to do this. So if you don't go to the Kingdom Hall, then I'm not going to do this. Or, if you're going to, in my case, if you're going to be disobedient, Ephesians 6:1, if you're going to be disobedient to your parent, and in my case, being disobedient meant standing up against my father, who was domestically abusing my mother. I won't say physically abusing her. I will just say mentally, emotionally, religiously, using the religion to hold over her head, threatening to take the kids, all the things in order for my mom to remain. In the Jehovah's Witness religion, you're not able to get a divorce. I remember having conversations with my dad, and he's like, yeah, there's sisters that get beat up and they still go to the Kingdom Hall, even though their husbands don't want them to go to the Kingdom Hall. So they definitely plant a seed in your brain where no matter what you're going through, you're going to stay. You're going to stay, because if you leave the organization, then you're leaving Jehovah. So fast forward, spent many, many hours in back rooms hoping and praying to Jehovah that, I could get some relief, because it gets exhausting when you are in a home, where your father is screaming and hollering and yelling, you know, um, not paying the bills because, I'm mad at your mom, and so I'm not going to pay the gas bill. So, no, there were times, where the gas was cut off, or we were being evicted from our home. And as an adult, and I look back in hindsight, it's kind of crazy, because as a woman now, I think to myself, like, if I'm in this marriage and I'm being abused, and I'm going in these back, rooms with these three men, and they're telling me all the things that I need to do, in order to fix this marriage, and they're not really acknowledging all the things that he's doing that's causing problems, that is going to spill into my relationship, into my marriage. And so, I can see how my parents start going through problems, and my father's way of punishing my mom, was obviously punishing us at the same time too, because the whole family had to go, without gas. Um, in hindsight, sometimes I feel like it was definitely used as a control mechanism, but I also realized there were some times where, maybe my father was dealing with um, his own stuff, that was causing him to do that. Watching his father be a womanizer and abusive to his mother. And so when you get involved into this religion, and it's very misogynistic, and you need to listen to your husband, and your husband is the head of your house, and they take that to a whole nother level. um so anyway, I digress. So moving into my years as a teenager, these are very crucial years. As you're trying to find yourself. When you're young, it's one thing. It's still hard, I would say, because you're going to school, and you're in elementary school. And, back then, because I was born in the 70s, late 70s, it's not like it is now. Nowadays, it's no longer a Christmas party. It's just a holiday party or a holiday break, because they recognize that people have different religion. So it's a little different. When I was growing up, it was very, here's this pamphlet on the first day of school, and here's this letter, dear Mr. or Mrs. So-and-so, Cheryl Madison is a Jehovah Witness and will not be able to participate in any religious activities or holidays. She will not be able to salute the flag. So you grow up very awkward. You grow up where every morning you don't even want to go to class, right? I was very, I loved learning, and I was very advanced. I tested with a very high IQ and was able to get accepted into like a gifted school. So I love learning, but I just remember every morning dreading going to school, because I walk in and everybody's stand up, right? Now everybody doesn't stand up. Some people will sit there. Some people stand up out of respect. But, and I remember several times feeling like some of the teachers were not as kind, because they looked at it like it was being disrespectful to our country, to stand and not salute the flag. So every day in elementary school, all the way through high school, was a challenge there. I will say that my mom, because my mom became a Jehovah's Witness as a kid, and she wasn't born into it, and I think she kind of knew. And so I will give her props, and I will say that when it came to holidays, she just didn't send me to school. So, whatever day the Christmas party was, I just didn't go to school that day. And she would write a note, and she would just explain that we are one of Jehovah's Witnesses, and Cheryl's not going to participate in that. And then there were times where she forgot to write the note, right? And if you forget to write the note and you just happen to be there, or let's just say it's somebody's birthday, right? It's somebody's birthday, and your teacher has already been instructed that you are not able to participate. So you become this awkward kid, right? Because now, right before the party, right before the cupcakes, everything's happening, all the things, and your teacher comes over to your desk and they're like, hey, you want to go ahead and sit out in the hallway? Or you would go to the library. A lot of times you would go to the library, but I remember times where the library already had a class, and so there was no going to the library. I remember just pretty much sitting crisscross applesauce outside of the door, and your teacher would give you something to color. Or I remember it wow, I just thought about it. I remember a lot of times they would make me read. So while all the other kids are in there, celebrating Sally or whoever, it wasn't Sally back then, but whoever's birthday, right? While they're all having fun, celebrating, the parents have dropped off sometimes pizza and cupcakes. You don't get to participate. You don't get a slice of pizza, right? You don't get a cupcake. And your teacher literally has you sitting outside the door, crisscross applesauce, while you're reading, Dear God Is Me, Margaret. I remember reading a lot of the books that I wasn't supposed to read, but they were part of the curriculum at the time. So I read them. Anyway, moving into junior high as a witness, I will not say they got any easier. It got a little bit easier as far as the holidays, because as most of you know, by the time you get to junior high, there's no cupcakes. You're not really celebrating like that at school. If anything, I didn't get to go to several parties, birthday parties, that I would get invited to. So, you're in junior high, you're trying to find yourself, and you just don't know what to do, because you're at peace at school, because you already know that when you get home, you got to deal with your parents arguing and fussing and fighting, or your father, I should say, yelling and screaming. And so when you're at school, you do get a break. So you're trying to enjoy school. But what happened to me in junior high was, that's when the conversations kind of started happening about, what are you going to do after school? What are you going to do after, what classes are you going to take to prepare yourself for high school, to prepare yourself for college? And at the time, it's now been recently changed after 47 years of my life. We were not allowed to go to college. You were not allowed to go to college, and it's so you're not even thinking that way, right? You're just going to school. You're not. I wasn't paying attention to history. I didn't pay attention to it because history was very triggering for me. History brought me into Armageddon, right? And all the signs and the different things that they would compare to watch for in the world that let you know that you were closer to the end of the end of the end of the end of the world. And so, history was like, I hated history. I had to definitely I don't know, read my one of my books that I like, but just I wasn't a history person. I was very heavy in my English and my writing and things like that, but like I said, at the same time, you're just pretty much doing the work so you can get a decent grade. But I always had like this overachiever, personality. I don't know if my overachiever personality is naturally who I am. I believe that it's partially naturally who I am, but I also believe that a part of it came from being a Jehovah Witness, right? You're never doing enough. And so, you do one thing, okay, well, now we need more. And then you do that thing, okay, well, now you need this. So, you're constantly chasing the carrot when you're growing up as a Jehovah's Witness, and you just don't feel like anything that you do is enough, and that ties into your mental, right? The child's mental, because you don't. In my case, I didn't have a stable home, and then so I'm feeling less than there. As a girl, my father, who, that your father is your first, encounter relationship, that you have with a man, where you're looking at, okay, well, this is how a man is supposed to treat you. And so, of course, I didn't have a good example there. If anything, I was like, I hope I never marry anybody like my father. I hope I never have to go through, what my mom had to go through with him. At the time, I didn't know all the details of his father abusing his mom and the things that he had seen. I'm not making no excuses for him. I do honestly believe that it is our responsibility as an adult to go seek the help that we need, no matter what type of environment we grew up in. It's our responsibility to go and get the help. What I will say is, as Jehovah Witnesses, you're not allowed to go get any type of counseling, right? So you're not allowed to seek inside counsel. Now that I have a degree in psychology, and, I've worked with clients and all the things, I can definitely see why, right? I can see why we were not allowed to go to therapy, because when I woke up recently, well, last year, when I woke up and decided I would no longer be a Jehovah's Witness, I will no longer be physically out, mentally in. As I'm telling my therapist all these things, I felt like I sound crazy. I said, I must sound crazy. It's really weird when you're in it. The cognitive distancing is so real that, like, you don't get it. But once, like the Bible says, once the blinders fall off and you realize that you are raised in this culture, in this high indoctrinated religion, that a lot of the things that are in there, a lot of the practices, the culture practices, are not even necessarily in the Bible. It's just these scriptures that are in there that they tie to the rules that they want to enforce. And so the cognitive distancing falls off, right? And you're like, I sound crazy when I say this. So I'm sitting there in therapy, and as I'm telling it, my therapist is telling me, like, yeah, you have religious trauma. You have childhood trauma. You were raised in a home of domestic violence. You were raised, in an environment, not in the house, but, still on the property, because we lived behind my grandparents. We moved behind my grandparents when I was in junior high, and I lived there, for the rest of my life. My grandparents are no longer with us, and my uncles are no longer with us, so no one's there at that house, but that's my family. But I grew up in a very toxic environment. it's funny too because you grow up and you have your own kids and you're like, I wanted to. I taught my kids about Jehovah. I talked to my kids about Jehovah, but there's certain aspects that I didn't expose them to, because I guess deep inside, I didn't want them to go through what I went through. I will say that I didn't get baptized, but although I didn't get baptized, when you are born and raised a Jehovah's Witness, there's an expectation. So, I went through all the books, so from a young child, I went through the Live Forever book. I went through the Great Teacher. I went through the Young People As. I went through all the books, went out in field service, knocked on doors, did all the things. But when it came time to go through those questions, I just would reflect on what I was going through at home. And I was like, I can't commit to this. I just can't commit to this because in my mind, I'm like, God is real, Jehovah's real, but I can't commit to this because I'm sitting back literally watching my mom, be abused by my dad, and there's nothing she could do. There was nothing we can do. There was nothing being done. And so I'm like, no. And I watched my mom, and several people in the Kingdom Hall, not able to get a divorce. So I'm like, wow, like I can't commit to this because, what if so there's this grooming that happens when you're born and raised as a Jehovah's Witness at a very young age. They start to groom you into dating the men there at the Kingdom Hall. And, you're not able to marry outside of the religion. And so since you're not, they groom you at a very young age where you're looking at, okay, who's the ministerial servant, who's the most spiritual in the congregation. And so I would always think like, hey, if I, at a young age, if I get baptized and then I find out that, my husband is anything like my dad, I'm stuck. And no matter how much I love Jehovah, I'm stuck. I cannot get out of this marriage. So I called myself playing it safe, where I would do all the things, right? And at that point, I'm already getting called into judicial meetings. If you're a witness, you know what I'm talking about. Or if you're ex-Jehovah's Witness, you know what I'm talking about. But, I was experiencing judicial meetings with my parents from the time I was 14 years old. So I'm doing all the things. I'm being treated as if... So pretty much the brothers come to you and you're going through these questions and everything, and they're telling you that, are you going to make the commitment to Jehovah? The older you get, especially when you're born in it, there's this expectation of you should have been baptized by now. So what happens is when you're young, a lot of the friends' parents are inviting you. They're like, oh, sure, come over. But as you get older, you'll start to notice that you're not as invited as much because, they're looking at you like you're spiritually weak, because you're 14 now and you're still not baptized, So you is what they call accurate knowledge. It's like, you have an accurate knowledge of Jehovah and you are refusing to dedicate your life to Jehovah. So that means that when Armageddon comes, you're going to die, right? So as a kid, you're looking at these books, and I remember seeing the baby, and the baby is, Noah's Ark, and the baby's outside the ark, and the baby's about to, be swept away in this flood, and, asking my parents, like, why? Like, why does the baby have to suffer? Why does the baby have to die? And then it was like, oh, well, who's going to take care of the baby? It's like, oh, okay. And I'm thinking, okay, well, all these adults here, right? Somebody could have took care of the baby. And then it goes into, well, that, only Jehovah can read the person's heart. So maybe that child came from a family that didn't have good hearts. And so, they knew, Jehovah knew this baby had to be destroyed because basically you came from a family of people that didn't have a good heart. In hindsight, it's so ironic because I think about that and it's like, I think about some of the things that I went through in the Kingdom Hall, with my family, and I look at my heart and there's just certain things that have been done to me that I could never have the heart to do that to my family and friends, or let alone my child that I love. I could never see myself doing some of the things that I went through. So anyway, you have an accurate knowledge. You've been born and raised in this, and you are not committing. And so since you're not committing, then you slowly start to not get invited. Which puts you in a position, honestly, it puts you in a position where now, you're going to want to hang out with your friends at school more. And at that point, okay, now you have this worldly association. It's like, what do you want me to do? Right? So I'm going to the Kingdom Hall and I'm doing all the things. But because I'm not getting baptized like some of my friends, I have friends that got baptized at 13 years old, 14 years old, because I'm not getting baptized like my teenage friends, I'm now considered spiritually weak. And so, we're the humans, like we're born to connect with people, right? I'm extremely extroverted. I've always been. I can talk to anybody, right? So it was very hard for me. There's no way that I'm gonna not be able to get invited as a teenager to all the little teenage functions that the teenagers are doing at the Kingdom Hall. But yet you don't want me to hang out with my worldly friends that I go to school with every day. So eventually I got to the point where my father stopped taking care of me financially. Of course, I had a roof over my head, all those things. But, because I started standing up for my mom, because in my mind, I'm like praying to Jehovah and I'm like, there is nothing loving about this. Fortunately, I never developed a resentment for God. I never developed any type of resentment, or I was never mad at him. It just became this anger where I was mad at the brothers because they weren't doing anything, right? And so if you are put in place and you are, back then, not anymore, but back then, they represented God, right? And so if you're representing God, you're representing Jehovah, then you gotta see what's going on. You gotta see, this domestic abuse that's going on in my home, right? So, you're at the Kingdom Hall and it's brother so-and-so, brother so-and-so. And by the time you leave the Kingdom Hall and get to the corner, your mom's getting cussed out. I really, and this is just my opinion, a part of it, I feel like the men who are Jehovah's Witness, they're not allowed to be men, right? And so I feel like a lot of them are, domestically abuse their wives and their daughters. I feel like they take that anger out on them because, imagine they tell you that you're the head of your household, but you're truly not the head of your household because, if they tell you something that needs to be done, you as a grown man, you have to do it. So, for example, for years, my father and the different men in the Kingdom Hall, they were not allowed to wear beards, right? They were not allowed to wear beards. Even though Jesus had a beard and everybody in the Bible back in the day had beards, they were not allowed to wear beards. So now that I look back on it, I think some of that came from, my father not really truly making decisions for his life. I mean, imagine you're a grown man and they're telling you you can't wear a beard, or you need to dress this way, or and I definitely understand um needing to be presentable, right? Needing to be presentable. But, you have to wear a suit. You have to do this. You have to do that. So it was just, for me, it was just like amazing how, they stood their ground on all those things, but they never stood their ground and said, hey, brother, you have these situations that are going on at your home. These are displaying signs of domestic violence. We're going to have to take your privileges away, or, I mean, I don't know, sometimes what, it's a lot. It's a lot. So I continue to go because out of my love for Jehovah, I'm going to go. I'm going to believe all the things that I was told. And then about a year and a half ago, I started accepting the fact that I was basically, softly shunned, right? Meaning, you're not going to be invited to certain things. My family would, they would deal with me. They would have a relationship with me, but it was very distant. There were times where my sister, graduated from high school, and it was like, oh, we're having a party tomorrow and, you're not invited. But why am I not invited? I'm not invited because I'm not a Jehovah's Witness, but you want me to believe that's not the reason why me and my family aren't invited. But you know that you are not welcomed because they don't associate, outside of the religion. And for years I dealt with that. For years I dealt with it. And I just finally got to a point where I was just like, it was starting to bother me. So anyway, long story short, I noticed that every time I would go back to the Kingdom Hall, I would have problems in my household. And I understand that, being married, having a family, you're going to have problems regardless. But every time that I would go back and try to get my life right, or something happened in the world, oh my God, Armageddon's coming, I need to get my life together. Every single time, I would have like this spiritual warfare in my home. I remember one time my son ran away, and I'm like, what is he running away from? And it was right before we were going to a meeting, and I remember going to the meeting and them telling me, everything's going to work out. This is just Satan. Satan is trying to stop you from getting your life together and returning to Jehovah. So about a year and a half ago, I just started noticing that. Fast forward, me and my husband, we have this altercation. We're arguing. The argument gets out of control. He pretty much comes outside and he's trying to get me to stop leaving. I'm in the car. And when I tell you, I literally have a flashback. I have a flashback of a time where my parents were fighting and my mom was in the car and she was trying to leave and my dad was trying to stop her from leaving. And let's just say, fortunately, that incident happened. But the odd part about that incident is it led it led my husband and I into therapy, right? So we end up in therapy, and my therapist is like, okay, you got individual counseling, right? So he goes to one room, I go to another room, and then you got, you need some additional. So I start seeing, as as a crisis specialist, I will say that at that point, I made up my mind where I'm going to go into this office and I'm going to tell them everything. And when I mean everything, I'm going to tell them everything. Because if I don't tell them everything, I'm not going to be able to move forward in this. I'm not going to be, my therapist is not going to be able to help me if I continue to mask. So, you go to therapy, and when you go to therapy, they are digging deep. And they have to tap into a little bit of your childhood. And so, as they're tapping into a part of my childhood, they're like, okay, you need another therapist, have you considered EMDR, all these things. And I'm like, you need a trauma therapist, because I can't explain it, but you just start remembering things, details of things that you block out because you don't want to deal with it. Or in my case, there were things. I had been with my husband for over 20 years, right? Over 20 years. And there was just things that happened to me that I never told him. And so my therapist was like, that's why you're having all these problems. Because you are masking. You have to tell your husband, you have to get this out, number one, so you can heal and you can move forward. You're going to have to tell your parents. But before you tell your parents, you have to tell your husband. So we go through, we went through a year of therapy, right? And in the end, the therapist was like, you guys both have your things, right? But your family in this religion and your childhood trauma, and holding this in, right? Because when you're raised to be a Jehovah's Witness, you don't tell everybody what you're going through. You mask it. This is the best life ever. I can't tell you the things that I had to deal with. So going to therapy, I can't explain the relief that it brought on my body physically, okay? My marriage, I can't even explain it, but like my relationship with my husband, it has never been this good. Not to say that it was, it wasn't good before, but I can't explain it, but just this level of, now he knows. Now he knows the things that I went through, and now he understands. A lot of it, you hide because you don't want people looking at your family weird. You don't want people looking at your parents weird. You don't want to say some of the things you went through because it's gonna be looked upon like, wow. That's all I can say is wow. Anyway, in this journey and me tapping into some of the things that I never told anyone, including my husband, I am praying. And I'm praying to Jehovah, and I'm like, Jehovah, I need relief. And I stumble. At the time, so I'm working for a company that deals with lawsuits, right? Different attorneys and different lawsuits. And a couple of the cases that we took on started to be child sexual assault. And so one of them was like the Catholic Charities, and another one was the religious Catholic group of boys' homes. And some of the teen homes where kids have been sexually assaulted. Anyway, in this, and because I was dealing with this at work, I stumble across the CSA Australian Royal Commission. And I tell you, I think it was 7 days altogether. And I just binge watched this case. And when I got done with this case, it was like, and I got done watching the leaders, the people that I had been raised to believe, the people that I thought, were protecting the children in the organization. When I finished that case, I could not ignore the fact that there's this 2-witness rule that says that if you are assaulted as a child and you don't have 2 witnesses to attest to this, there's nothing you can do. There's nothing they're going to do about it. And I don't know if any pedophile that brings 2 witnesses, before they assault a child. And I took that to my therapist, and I basically had to make some decisions. So I presented that information to my husband. We kind of processed everything that I had gone through, uncomfortable conversations in those back rooms with elders as a teenager. And I decided that even if it meant that I would lose my family and they wouldn't talk to me again, I can no longer continue to go to the Kingdom Hall. I can no longer be a part of this organization. There would be no way at that point I would get baptized into it, knowing that, there are rules in place that are protecting pedophiles. And then it dawned on me that you're safe, Cheryl. You're not, you didn't get baptized. So you're safe. Your family is not going to, stop talking to you. And I was wrong. I was wrong. There's something that happens that I can't say it happens to everybody, but in my case, I love God. So there was something that happened in me where, if this is not the true religion, then what is the true religion? And so you start searching and you start seeking, right? So my grandmother, who went to church, I remember she always would tell me, go to church in your local neighborhood, pour into your neighborhood. So that's what I did. I went to church. And it was amazing how I went to church and I found a women's Bible ministry. So it was perfect timing. I started going to this women's Bible ministry. And we went through a book with the gospel. We went through the book of John. And I knew a lot of the things, right? I knew a lot of the things. I could totally engage in these women's ministry Bible studies because I was raised Jehovah's Witness, right? So I knew my Bible. But, one of the women said to me, she's like, you got to get a regular Bible. And I'm like, what do you mean a regular Bible? You have to get a regular Bible because the Jehovah's Witness Bible is not the same Bible And I'm like, it's the same Bible. It's just that, they just added Jehovah's name back into this Bible. Jehovah's name was taken out the Bible, and, they just put it back in. But because of the deception, and because I saw Jeffrey Jackson, one of the governing body members, lie on the stand. So this is the same person that I'm going to the Kingdom Hall, I'm watching these videos, I'm introducing, I'm showing my husband these videos, and babe, this is the governing body, and this is where we get our direction from, because, at this point, when you start trying to get closer to God, you're going to go back to what you were taught, what you were raised in. And so I'm trying to explain it to him. And here I am watching the governing body, somebody that I had been watching for years, lie on the stand. So then I said, well, if he can lie on the stand, then maybe this Bible isn't the same, right? So, of course, what do? I go get a King James Version Bible, the Bible that I always, got my grandmother. And then I got an NIV version. And I'm like, let me, and you just go down this rabbit hole and you're just digging, right? And you start to realize, one little single word can change the whole entirety of the scripture. So at this point, I had never experienced such calmness in my home as I was experiencing when I was going to the Kingdom Hall. When I tell you that I would get up on Sunday and I would go to church, or Tuesday I would go to the women's Bible study, my husband was so supportive. I can't even explain it. I could not understand that. Why is it that every time I go back to the Kingdom Hall, we are at each other's necks? You know what I mean? And then that's when it dawned on me, like, you're being forced to be something that you're not, right? Or, maybe your spouse is like, okay, I get it, I'm a believer in God, but there's something about this thing, this religion, that does not feel right to me. So because I was pressured, and I remember going back to the Kingdom Hall several times over the last 20 years that I was with my husband, I decided I'm not going to pressure him. I'm not going to pressure him. If he comes to church, he come to church. If he don't come to church, he don't come to church. This is my journey. This is for me. This is what I'm doing. This is the conversation I had with God, where I needed to find closure and move forward. So, I pretty much just go and I do my thing. And at this time, I was in denial. I things were going great in my marriage, and I wanted to share that, with my family. Like, hey, this is what's going on. And, of course, they didn't want to hear it. They wanted me to find all the peace, going to the Kingdom Hall. They didn't want me to say, hey, I'm going to church now, and my marriage, my relationship has never been this calm while I'm in, trying to seek God, right? I'm putting the pieces to the puzzle, of this spiritual warfare that happens in my household every time I go to the Kingdom Hall. But now, and I will say I have to give partial credit to therapy, right? Because I'm like, you need God and you need therapy. Can't say that enough. You need God and you need therapy to heal from the things that you never told anybody, or to heal from the things that, you were ashamed to tell, couldn't tell, shoved deep down where you, to the point where you forgot it even happened, whatever your situation is. So I told my family, and I got on this journey, to get into this relationship with Jesus and remove religion and just, this personal relationship. And I guess I started sharing too much on Facebook, my journey. And at that point, I started, my family started distancing. That point, my dad's calling me, and he's like, Satan is the one that sent you to church, not God, and you're going to die in Armageddon. And at this point, I'm triggered to the screaming, the hollering, the yelling, and what I had to go through with him as a kid. But this time, I hang up the phone, and I get in bed with my husband, and he's like, what was that? And I'm like, that was me telling my dad how happy I am and how good we're doing now that I'm no longer a Jehovah's Witness. Now that I'm no longer going to the Kingdom Hall, doing all the things, in order to get back in their good grace, trying to prove that I'm worthy to hang out with. And you're never going to be worthy to hang out with. The one thing I will say is that I learned real fast that you go to the Kingdom Hall and your husband is not in, right? So at this point, you're dealing with, your husband is, he's, your children are fatherless. You have, what do you mean my children are fatherless? Their father, I'm married to their father, and their father's in the home. But no, in their eyes, my children were fatherless because my husband was not a Jehovah's Witness. And what I will say, and I will warn, if you are a woman and you start going back to the Kingdom Hall, or you start going to the Kingdom Hall and studying with the witnesses, or going back to try to please your family, or, it really wasn't going back to please my family. Portions of it was, but ultimately I love God and just seeking that relationship with him, not understanding that, I'm not really going there to serve God. I'm going there to, to serve this organization, right? So, you're getting baptized. You're not getting baptized in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. You are getting baptized, and you are expressing that you are now one of Jehovah's Witnesses, right? You're one of Jehovah's Witnesses, but that's another video. So I'm going to have to do a part 2 to this video. This was a lot to unpack. I'm sure there's some key things that I missed out on. I'm just, Monday morning thinking about it, came for a run, decided to sit in my car and shoot my first video to kind of talk about all the things. My next video, I'm definitely going to go deeper into, which I believe a lot of people are going to start talking about, is, this unsaid responsibility that, you will be shunned if you were born and raised a Jehovah's Witness and you don't comply. If you are born and raised a Jehovah's Witness, or let's just say you came in when you was 9 and now you're 45, whatever. if you were raised as a Jehovah's Witness, you are not safe because you don't get baptized. The moment you decide you want to give your life to Christ, become a different religion, the moment you decide to talk about the uncomfortable conversations that happen in your home, you're done. You're done. And it does something to your mental. You don't really understand. You're trying to, unpackage this whole thing of wait, but I didn't get baptized. Why is my sister hardly talking to me? You understand what I'm saying? Why is this family, why is my father, not talking to me? Or randomly, you're getting text messages from your family that says, I love you. And that's the extent of your relationship, because you decided that you no longer want to participate in a religion where you have childhood trauma, where you have religious trauma from. So we'll go more deeper into that. Just something that I was feeling on this Monday morning. I didn't get dressed to come do a video. I actually thought I was coming out here just to do a run to clear my head. But I decided to post my first video. So you guys have a great day. Don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel. And there will be more to come. And I will be unpackaging a lot of these uncomfortable conversations, and helping, a lot of people heal from the things that they mask and they don't talk about. Thanks for listening.